I, Tala, have always known that John was different from anyone else I had ever met. Our initial connection in college was electrifying. He was driven, filled with ideas and plans for the future, while I was content to soak in the college experience at a leisurely pace. We met in a literature class where our interpretations often clashed, sparking lively debates that extended into late-night coffee sessions. John had this intensity about him, always planning, always pushing forward. I was drawn to his passion and his clear vision for a life outside the confines of his parental home. "Let's make a pact," he once said as we walked through the quiet college campus under a blanket of stars. "Let's promise to always chase what we want, no matter how hard it gets." His words were more than a youthful dream, they were a vow to himself, and somehow, I had become a part of that promise. After college, things moved quickly. John proposed during our graduation ceremony, pulling out a modest ring in front of our cheering friends. It was impulsive and perfectly John. Our marriage followed soon after, much to the disapproval of his parents. His mother, a stern woman with sharp eyes, made no effort to hide her disdain for me. She had envisioned a different life for John, one involving a woman of her choosing, someone who could fit seamlessly into their family's traditional mold. We moved into a small apartment, and John started a tech startup with some college friends. The days were long, and the nights often saw him slumped over his laptop, coding and recalculating his business moves. I supported him as best as I could, handling our modest household and working part-time at a local bookstore to add to our income. Our life was a far cry from his parents' well-ordered, comfortable existence, but it was ours, and it was real. His mother's coldness towards me never thawed. At family gatherings, her comments were thinly veiled criticisms, and she often reminded John of the life he could have had if he had made better choices. Despite this, our love remained strong, fortified by the challenges we faced together. However, the pressure was always there, a silent force gnawing at John's spirit. The day John took his own life was the day everything broke. The shock, the profound grief, and the sense of irrevocable loss were overwhelming. And yet, amidst this deep mourning, there was no respite from his family's harsh judgments. The funeral was the epitome of this enduring strain. His father tried to mediate, but the accusations from my mother-in-law cut through the somber atmosphere. "If he hadn't married you, he wouldn't have taken his own life," she hissed quietly as we stood by his graveside. The audacity of her blame was suffocating. I clenched my fists, holding back tears of rage and despair. All I wanted was to grieve my husband, my partner, but instead, I was defending myself against unjust accusations. After we left the funeral home, I collapsed into bed, hoping sleep would grant me a brief escape from the relentless pain. But the next morning brought no peace. The usual demand to fetch the newspaper was accompanied by a discovery, an envelope tucked inside, containing a message that promised yet another upheaval. The words written in John's unmistakable handwriting hinted at secrets he had kept, ones that could change everything. As I held the envelope, my heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. Whatever was inside, I knew it would set the course for what I needed to do next. As I held the small box with the ring, a surge of emotions flooded through me. My mind raced back to the very beginning, when John and I were just two college students with big dreams. Now, here he was, affirming our future together. "Of course," I said, my voice a mix of joy and resolve. "I've wanted this as much as you have." We celebrated our engagement quietly, with a few close friends who had been with us since our university days. That night, as we lay side by side, John shared more of his vision for the future. "With the company doing well, I think we can start planning for the next big step. Maybe look for a new place, somewhere we can really call our own," he suggested, his voice filled with excitement. The company had indeed become a significant part of our lives. John's passion project, the adoption website, had started to gain traction. He poured his heart into making the platform both informative and empathetic, providing a voice for those often unheard. "It's important," he would say, "that everyone involved gets to share their story. We need to give them a space to be heard." Despite the success, John often struggled with the pressure. His parents' disapproval of his career choices remained a heavy burden. They still think I should have taken a real job, especially Mom, he confessed one evening, looking weary. She doesn't see this as a stable future. The tension between maintaining his independence and pleasing his parents wore on him, sometimes leaving him gloomy and restless. Seeing him like this, I felt a deep resolve to support him unconditionally. "We'll get through this together," I assured him, holding his hand tightly. "You're doing something amazing, and I'm here for you, every step of the way." Our plans for the future were filled with potential and hope. We discussed moving to a bigger apartment, possibly starting a family, and expanding the company further. Each conversation built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of shared dreams and commitments. However, these dreams were tempered by the realities we faced. The night before our graduation, John finally confronted his parents with his success and our plans. To our relief, they began to understand the significance of what he had built. "I think they're starting to see the value in what I do," John said with a relieved smile after a long discussion with them. "It feels like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." Now, standing in our kitchen with the engagement ring sparkling on my finger, I felt a wave of gratitude for the journey we had embarked on together. "Here's to us, and to a future we build on our own terms," John toasted, his voice steady and sure. Our life, intertwined between our personal love and our professional venture, blossomed. We were not only partners in life, but in business, facing each day with renewed determination and love. As we moved forward, our relationship deepened, fortified by the challenges we overcame and the successes we celebrated. Each step, each decision, brought us closer, weaving our lives together in ways we had always dreamed of. "John, could you please speak to your mother?" I asked, my voice tinged with a mix of bewilderment and irritation as she stood in our living room, uninvited and clearly upset about something. John's gaze flitted between me and his mother, a silent plea for patience evident in his eyes. "Mom, what's going on? Why didn't you call before coming over?" John's tone was gentle, yet firm, as he tried to balance respect for his mother with his loyalty to me, his new wife. His mother's face was a storm of emotions, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something amiss. I needed to see where you were living now. This is all so sudden, John. You getting married, moving out. And with someone we hardly know." I watched the scene unfold, feeling a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just about her sudden visit or the lack of a prior phone call. There was an underlying tension, a palpable discomfort that seemed rooted in something deeper than the usual mother-in-law concerns. "Mom, we've talked about this," John said, his voice steady but his hands betraying his anxiety as they fidgeted with the edge of his shirt. "Tala is my wife now. We need to respect our space and our decisions." His mother sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as she looked at me again, this time with a more measured gaze. I know. It's just hard to let go sometimes. But I'm here today, because there's something important we need to discuss." John and I exchanged a glance, a silent communication that crossed the space between us in an instant. Whatever was coming, we would face it together. "All right, Mom. Let's sit down and talk about it," John suggested, motioning towards the couch. We all took our seats, the air heavy with anticipation and the faint hum of the city outside barely audible through the closed windows. As she settled in, John's mother took a deep breath, her next words hanging in the balance as she gathered her thoughts. "It's about the family business," she began, her voice trailing off as if unsure how to continue. Enthusiasm hanging on her every word as she detailed her plans for expansion and innovation. John, sitting beside me, contributed a few strategic insights, which were quickly overshadowed by Jolie's more flamboyant proposals. I could feel his frustration as he tried to engage, only to be subtly sidelined. It was during these moments that I saw the weight of his silence, a resignation to his role in the family that seemed ingrained over years of similar occurrences. Despite this, he remained supportive of his sister, his pride in her achievements evident, even if it meant diminishing his own presence. Observing all this, I began to understand the family dynamics more clearly. The parents, particularly the father, showed a marked preference for Jolie, often praising her for initiatives and overlooking John's consistent contributions. This preferential treatment was not overt but displayed in little acknowledgments and affirmatives that accumulated into a significant bias. One afternoon, after a particularly tense discussion where John's ideas were dismissed once more, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. John was quiet, his usual upbeat demeanor shadowed by the day's events. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "John, it must be tough, feeling like you're not being heard," I said softly, trying not to push him too much, but wanting to acknowledge his struggle. He sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry more than just frustration. "It's always been this way. Ever since we were kids, Jolie was always the star, and I was the support. I love her, I do, but sometimes, I just wish." He trailed off, not finishing his sentence, but he didn't have to. I understood. John wanted to be seen for his own merits, not just as a background to his sister's vibrant canvas. "John, I see you," I assured him, squeezing his hand gently. "I see how hard you work and how much you care. Maybe it's not acknowledged as it should be, but it doesn't go unnoticed by me." He smiled, a small but genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Tala. That means more than you might realize." As we prepared to face another day living under the same roof as his family, I knew our challenges were far from over. However, I was determined to be John's ally, to be his voice when he felt overshadowed and to ensure that, at least between us, there was recognition and respect. From then on, I took it upon myself to subtly highlight John's contributions during family conversations, making sure to draw attention to his ideas and praising his efforts. It was a small gesture, but it seemed to lift John's spirits, giving him a bit more confidence each day to assert his place in the family discourse. This new role I took on wasn't without its difficulties. Sometimes, my mother-in-law would cast me a wary glance, sensing the shift in dynamics. But as days passed, even she began to respond more positively to John, perhaps influenced by my persistent acknowledgement of his worth. Despite the complex family relationships and the underlying tensions, I held on to hope that, bit by bit, I could help bring about a change, not just for John's sake, but for the harmony of the family we were now irrevocably part of. Father-in-law, I felt a cold dread settle in. His actions were completely inappropriate, and the accusation from my mother-in-law was both absurd and hurtful. Trying to process it all, I realized the importance of handling this delicately, especially considering John's feelings and our relationship. Yet, the fear of further conflict with his parents made me hesitant to disclose everything to him immediately. "John, I'm really trying to adjust here, but it's more challenging than I expected," I confided, hoping to at least share some of my discomfort without revealing the full extent of the incident. "Your father, well, he's quite a character, and your mother's approach to things, it's quite different from what I'm used to." John's brow furrowed in concern. "I know it's been tough for you, especially with my mom. She can be overwhelming. And Dad, with his condition, it's a lot. Just remember, I'm here for you. We can figure this out together." I nodded, grateful for his support, but still carrying the weight of the secret I wasn't yet ready to share. "Thank you, John. It means a lot to have your support. It's just a lot to take in, the dynamics here are complex." Later that day, while John was out, I found myself alone with his sister, Jolie. I decided it might be worthwhile to try and understand her perspective, especially given her close relationship with their parents. "Jolie, can I ask you something?" I ventured cautiously, not wanting to overstep, but desperate for insights. "Of course," she replied, her tone open and seemingly genuine. "How do you manage with everything here? The family dynamics, they seem quite intense." My question was vague, but I hoped it would encourage her to share her own experiences. Jolie paused, considering her words carefully. "It's not always easy. Mom and Dad have their ways, and I've learned how to navigate that over the years. It takes time to get used to it, I guess. You're doing fine, though." Her response was diplomatic, offering little in the way of concrete advice, but confirming the complexity I had felt. It was somewhat comforting to know that even Jolie acknowledged the intense family dynamics. As the day drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the situation. The day's events and conversations had left me with a lot to consider. How would I navigate the tricky waters of this family life without losing myself or harming my relationship with John? It was a question that lingered as I prepared for another day, hoping for a resolution yet bracing for more challenges. To work at John's company? It was a question that lingered in my mind, mingling with a mix of suspicion and hope. Perhaps Jolie's decision was not merely about career opportunities, but something deeper, possibly linked to the ongoing tensions within the family. "I want to be where I can make the most difference," Jolie explained later when we had a moment to talk privately. "And right now, that's with John. He's been under a lot of pressure, not just from the business, but from our parents too. I think I can help ease that." Her words gave me a different perspective on her intentions. It wasn't just about professional aspirations, it was also about family dynamics and her role within them. Her decision to join John's company might indeed bring her closer to the daily issues he faced and provide him with support that he desperately needed but seldom received at home. The next morning, after John left for work early and our mother-in-law busied herself with her usual routines, Jolie pulled me aside. "Listen, Tala," she began, her expression serious, "I know things have been tough for you here, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to do more. But with me at the company, I'll be able to keep an eye on things more closely, not just for the business but for you and John as well." Her assurance was comforting, yet the gravity of our situation weighed heavily on me. The covert manipulation by my in-laws was more than a simple family disagreement, it was a calculated exertion of control, and now Jolie was positioning herself as an ally in a way I hadn't anticipated. Throughout the day, I busied myself with the tasks my mother-in-law had listed, my mind often drifting to Jolie's promise and what it might mean for our future. Her proactive approach to support us was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere cultivated by her parents. By the time John came home that evening, I had managed to complete all the errands and prepare dinner, a small act of normalcy in the ongoing drama of our domestic life. John, noticing my fatigue, wrapped his arms around me in a quiet embrace. "You look exhausted. Was today rough?" he asked, concern lining his features. I nodded, leaning into his comfort. "It's just been a long day," I replied, not yet ready to disclose everything. "But Jolie and I had a good talk. She's really stepping up to support us." John's expression softened. "I'm glad Jolie is there for you. We'll get through this, together," he reassured me, but the tension in his voice was palpable. He knew, as did I, that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, yet Jolie's unexpected solidarity offered a glimmer of hope. As we sat down to dinner, the future seemed slightly less daunting. Jolie's decision to work alongside John might bring new dynamics into play, potentially altering the balance of power within the family and at the business. Whatever her reasons, her involvement was now an integral part of our strategy to navigate the complex web of family politics we were caught in. "He's been struggling a lot lately," I began, my voice faltering as I recounted the recent events to my father. "His work has consumed him more than ever, and he's using sleeping pills to manage his stress. It's not like him, and I'm really worried." My father listened intently, his expression a mixture of concern and contemplation. "Work can sometimes be a refuge from personal issues," he said thoughtfully. "But it sounds like he might be avoiding dealing with something deeper. It's good that Jolie is there with him now." Nodding, I felt a surge of gratitude for Jolie's presence and support, but the anxiety about leaving John in such a state gnawed at me. "Yes, she's been incredibly supportive. They're not just siblings, they really look out for each other." The next day, as I helped prepare arrangements for my mother's funeral, my phone buzzed continuously with messages from Jolie, updating me on John's condition and the goings-on at the company. Her messages were reassuring, yet they couldn't completely ease the knot of worry in my stomach. "John's been quiet today, more withdrawn than usual," one message read. "I'm keeping a close eye on him, but he's really pushing himself too hard." I sighed, feeling helpless so far from home. The juxtaposition of dealing with my mother's sudden passing and worrying about my husband's deteriorating state left me emotionally stretched thin. Amidst the funeral preparations, I couldn't help but feel torn, my thoughts constantly drifting back to John. After the funeral, with many relatives still around, I took a moment for myself outside, the cool air providing a small relief from the overwhelming grief and stress. My phone rang, and Jolie's name flashed on the screen. "Tala, I just wanted to check in," Jolie's voice came through, slightly strained. "John's really not doing well. He hasn't slept much, and I'm starting to get really worried. He won't listen to me about taking a break. Thank you for letting me know, Jolie. Keep trying to get him to rest." "I'll be back as soon as I can," I responded, my mind racing with concern for John. "Of course," she replied. "And Tala, take the time you need there. We'll manage here. Just focus on your family now." Hanging up, I felt a mix of gratitude for Jolie's support and a deepening worry for John. It was clear that we both needed to be there for each other, but being pulled in two directions made it all the more difficult. As I walked back inside, I resolved to discuss everything with my father, hoping he could offer some wisdom on how to handle the dual crises unfolding in my life. But he wouldn't. I couldn't finish my sentence, the words catching in my throat as sobs began to overtake me. Jolie held me tight, her own tears mingling with mine as we stood in the stark, overly bright corridor of the hospital. "It doesn't make sense," I managed to choke out between sobs. "He was stressed, yes, but to think he'd..." "No, there has to be another explanation." Jolie nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, Tala. I thought the same. But when I found him, it was just too late. The paramedics tried everything, but..." Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. We both knew the gravity of what had happened, but accepting it seemed impossible. The hospital's sterile smell and the distant sounds of medical equipment seemed to amplify the silence between us. After a few moments, we gathered ourselves enough to speak with the police officers who had been waiting patiently. They explained that they needed to talk to me about the circumstances leading up to John's death, to piece together his last days. "Mrs. Smith," one of the officers began, "we understand this is a difficult time, but any information about Mr. Smith's state of mind recently could be crucial." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "He was working very hard lately," I said. "He had been under a lot of pressure at work. And he was using sleeping pills to help him rest. But I never imagined he would." The words were hard to say, each one a weight on my heart. The officer nodded, taking notes. "Did he mention anything to you recently that might have indicated he was thinking about harming himself?" "No," I replied firmly. "He was tired, stressed from work, but suicide? He would have talked to me, or Jolie, or..." "This can't be right." The officers exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. "We'll need to investigate further, of course. His phone, his belongings, we'll need to go through everything to understand his actions." The reality of the situation hit me anew. John's privacy, our life together, would now be dissected in an attempt to find answers. I nodded, knowing it was necessary, yet dreading what they might or might not find. After the officers left, Jolie and I sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The echo of my earlier conversation with John played over in my mind. How he had insisted he was managing, how I had believed him. "I should have seen it," I whispered, more to myself than to Jolie. "You couldn't have known," Jolie replied gently. "We all saw he was stressed, but we never thought. We couldn't have known this would happen." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Arrangements for John's affairs, speaking with his parents, who were in shock themselves, and the endless signatures and decisions that seemed so trivial now that he was gone. As the day turned to evening, the finality of John's absence settled over me like a heavy cloak. I was now left to navigate this new, unwanted reality without him, holding on to the fragments of our life together, trying to make sense of a senseless act. The pain was overwhelming, but Jolie's support and the need to find answers kept me grounded. We would find out why this had happened. We had to find it first. Curious and slightly apprehensive, I opened the envelope carefully, revealing several sheets of paper inside. They appeared to be copies of emails and medical reports. My hands trembled as I began to sift through the documents, each page potentially holding clues to the unbearable reality of John's sudden departure from this world. As I absorbed the content, the picture began to form, a chain of communications between John and his therapist, along with detailed notes from his last few sessions. It was clear from the therapist's observations that John had been deeply struggling with his mental health, feeling an overwhelming pressure that was much more intense than I had realized. There were mentions of unbearable expectations and escalating anxiety, which seemed to coincide with the mounting responsibilities at work and the constant tension at home. Sitting alone in the quiet of the early morning, I felt a profound sadness mixed with frustration. These documents painted a portrait of a man desperately seeking help, grappling with his thoughts and emotions in a battle that few knew he was fighting. Why hadn't he shared more of this with me? Could I have done more to help him? Lost in these thoughts, Jolie walked in, her eyes puffy from crying but alert. "What's that?" she asked, noticing the papers scattered around me. "John's medical records and some emails from his therapist," I explained, handing her a few of the sheets. She scanned them quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to sorrow to anger. This explains so much," Jolie whispered, her voice cracking. "He was really suffering, wasn't he? And all this while, everyone just expected him to cope, to keep performing at work, to deal with everything at home." "Yes, it does," I replied, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "He felt trapped, Jolie. Trapped by his responsibilities, by his role in the family, by his own expectations of himself." We sat together, poring over the documents, discussing what we read, and trying to piece together the final days of John's life. It was a painful process, but it was also illuminating. We began to understand the depth of John's distress and the complexity of his thoughts and feelings during those last weeks. "I need to show these to his parents," Jolie said determinedly after a long silence. "They need to see what John was going through. Maybe then they'll understand it wasn't anyone's fault." "Not really." I nodded in agreement, though I doubted it would change their perspective. The blame had been placed, the judgments made. But perhaps, for our own peace and for John's memory, we needed to try to explain, to show the undeniable evidence of his inner turmoil. Gathering the documents, we prepared to confront his parents, armed with the truth about their son's struggles. It wouldn't bring John back, but maybe it could bring some understanding, some closure to the relentless cycle of blame and grief that had taken hold of the family. As we walked toward the house to face what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation, I felt a mix of dread and determination. This was necessary, not just for John's memory, but for all of us who were left behind, trying to make sense of a tragedy that had seemed senseless. We were ready to face the harsh truths, armed with nothing but the stark realities laid bare on paper. To handle this delicately, yes, but we also need to be direct and resolve these issues to prevent further harm. Jolie looked up, her eyes filled with a resolute fire that hadn't been there before. "You're right, Tala. We need to confront Dad about the financial issues and the plans he had for the company. If John thought this was worth mentioning in his final letter, it's something we can't just ignore." We decided to gather more information before approaching her father. I started by contacting John's contacts in the company under the pretense of tying up loose ends on his projects. Meanwhile, Jolie agreed to discreetly look through financial records and correspondences in her father's office. Through our investigations, we pieced together a clearer picture. The company was indeed in a dire financial state, much worse than anyone outside the immediate family knew. Documents and emails hinted at desperate attempts to secure funding, with several risky deals that hadn't panned out. It appeared John's fears were justified, the company was on the brink, and his father had been banking on leveraging Jolie's upcoming role to stabilize it. Armed with this information, Jolie and I approached her father. We found him in his study, deep in thought over stacks of paperwork. His expression was weary, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. "Dad, we need to talk about the company," Jolie started, her voice steady, despite the tremor I knew she felt. "John left us some information, and we've confirmed it. The company's financial situation, it's critical. And your plans to transfer responsibilities to me, I need to understand why you thought that was the best course." Her father looked up, surprise evident on his face, quickly morphing into resignation. "I was trying to protect our family," he began slowly, "to keep everything we've worked for from falling apart. I thought if I could stabilize the company, everything would go back to normal." "But at what cost, Dad?" Jolie pressed, her voice firm. John felt so cornered by all this that he couldn't see any other way out. "We can't keep going like this." The conversation that followed was long and difficult. Her father was defensive at first, but as we laid out the facts and expressed our own fears and hopes for the future, he began to see the situation from our perspective. It was clear that changes were needed, not just for the company's sake, but for the family's well-being. By the end of our discussion, we had agreed on a few critical steps. The company would undergo a transparent audit, and we would seek professional advice on restructuring. Jolie would still be involved, but not as a last-minute savior, a role she had never agreed to take on. Her father finally understood that the weight of his decisions had consequences far beyond financial statements. As Jolie and I left the study, I felt a cautious hope. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time since John's passing, it seemed like we were taking steps in the right direction, not just to salvage a company, but to mend a family torn by secrets and burdens too great for any one person to bear alone. Spreading out some documents on the conference table. "I think these will really help foster a more supportive environment here. We need to ensure that no one else feels overwhelmed like John did." I nodded, reviewing the proposals. They included new mental health initiatives, more flexible work hours, and an open-door policy with HR. "These are solid," I replied, feeling a surge of pride. Implementing these will not only improve morale, but also help us honor John's memory in a way that makes a real difference. As we discussed the details, I realized how far we had come from those dark days. The office no longer felt oppressive, there was a new vibrancy to it, a sense of community that had been sorely lacking. Employees seemed more relaxed, and there was a noticeable increase in collaboration and open communication. In the following weeks, Jolie and I also established a wellness program that included regular check-ins with a therapist and workshops on stress management. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many employees expressing gratitude for the changes. It was clear that while the path was not easy, it was the right one. One evening, as we were locking up the office, Jolie turned to me with a thoughtful look. "You know, I think John would have been really proud of what we're doing," she said softly. "It feels like we're finally moving in the right direction, not just in business, but in being the kind of people he always hoped we'd be." Her words resonated deeply. "Yes, I think so too," I responded, locking the door behind us. "It's not just about business success anymore. It's about people, about making sure they feel valued and supported." As we walked away from the building, I looked up at the stars, imagining John looking down on us. Despite the pain and the tumultuous journey, I felt a profound connection to his spirit, a guiding force as we navigated this new chapter. Back at our new home, Jolie and I continued discussing our plans for the future, both for the company and our personal lives. We talked about establishing a foundation in John's name to support mental health awareness and to help those in the corporate world cope with stress and pressure. "Let's make sure his legacy isn't just about how he died, but how he lived and what we learned from him," Jolie suggested, and I wholeheartedly agreed. With each new policy we implemented, each decision made with compassion and foresight, I felt we were building something meaningful, something that would stand as a testament to John's life and our journey beyond the tragedy. As the weeks turned into months, the changes became more rooted, and the company's culture shifted perceptibly. It was becoming a place where people were genuinely happy to come to work, where they felt safe and appreciated, a legacy of John's vision, shaped by our hands. Living with Jolie, working together, and steering the company in a new direction, I felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose that I hadn't known before. John's absence would always be a void in our lives, but in living out his unfulfilled wishes, in honoring his memory through our actions, we found a way to keep his spirit alive and bring some peace to our hearts. I often thought of him, hoping that when we met again, I could tell him about all we had accomplished, not just in business, but in making his unseen dreams a reality. In the quiet